Thank you for that introduction. I'm delighted to be here. I want to thank several people here at the museum. First, Peter Hasrick, of course, for including me in this project and for suggesting the topic of my essay. And I want to thank Sylvia Huber for all her help with my images, and Nicole Harrison for her unwavering assistance with the logistics, and Chuck Preston, I'm not sure if he's here, but for his observations regarding bighorn sheep. And I want to thank all of you for your presence today. I know many of you have traveled from quite a distance to be here. So my talk will focus on Bierstadt as an animal painter. This is a self-portrait of Bierstadt painting in Yosemite. Bierstadt, famous for his landscapes, was also an accomplished animal painter. Throughout his career, animals, both domestic and wild, appeared in his artworks. He had a keen interest in natural history, and like artists, naturalists before him, he collected specimens that he studied and painted from. That he was particularly interested in animals is made clear by the dozens of sketches and oil studies of animals that he made. When he built Malkasten, his studio in Irvington-on-Hudson in New York in 1865, the grounds outside were especially arranged, as he put it, with a view to painting animals under the best possible conditions of light, shade, and background. Although a skilled animal painter, clearly Bierstadt's primary interest as an artist was to be a landscape painter. And in his finished paintings, the animals are usually subordinated to the landscape. Nonetheless, in some of his artworks, the animals are larger and share equal importance with the landscape, and on occasion, the animal is the main subject, and the landscape is secondary. In this paper, I'll discuss Bierstadt as an animal painter and consider the motivations, influences, and inspirations that led the artist to periodically focus on animals and let the landscape serve as a backdrop. In November of 1853, at the age of 23, Bierstadt left for Europe to study art in Dusseldorf, Germany, spending almost 4 years abroad, returning in the summer of 1857. This is an overall map of Germany, and Dusseldorf, this is in this red square, and this is a detail of the red dots, and you can see, oops, no one had done that before. This is Soligen, this is where he was born, and then this is Dusseldorf, so they were only 21 miles apart. So it's kind of natural for him to gravitate back there. Dusseldorf was a vibrant and a popular art center and continues to be so today. Although Bierstadt's focus was to learn landscape painting, the artistic training in Dusseldorf stressed observation of nature, objective realism, and attention to detail, all skills that enabled him to paint realistic, although often idealized, depictions of animals. When Bierstadt was in Dusseldorf, the atmosphere there among the American artists was one of camaraderie and brotherhood, fostered by the outgoing personality of Emanuel Leutze, a highly successful artist and teacher. Leutze took a personal interest in the arriving Americans, finding them places to live and studio space. He created a sense of community and an atmosphere of mutual support, helping to found Malkasten, in English, paint box, an artist club, and that's the slide that you see on the right, in which German and American artists came together to share art ideas and to socialize. It's still an active association today, and there's a street near the Dusseldorf Academy named after Leutze. Originally, Bierstadt had intended to study with his mother's cousin, the artist Johann Hassenklever, or as Peter likes to call him, Uncle Pete. He was a portrait and a genre painter, and this is an example of one of his genre paintings, The Studio. Bierstadt set sail for Europe in November of 1853, and Hassenklever died that fall, shortly before Bierstadt got to Dusseldorf. With little money and nowhere to go, Bierstadt shared a studio with this artist, Thomas Worthington Whitridge, who was predominantly a landscape painter. Bierstadt never actually attended the Dusseldorf Academy. Instead, he received private tutoring from Whitridge and Leutze, whose repertoire included history, animal, and landscape painting. He was also mentored by landscape painters Karl Lessing and Andreas Achenbach, both at the Dusseldorf Academy. In his autobiography, Whitridge wrote that equipped with a paint box, Bierstadt explored the Westphalian countryside, making sketches, and then he would return to Whitridge's studio to paint large canvases by composing and putting together parts of studies that he had made. Although the domestic animals in these early scenes, such as those seen here at House in the Woods, are small pastoral elements, Bierstadt convincingly captured their physical presence and attitude. A sketch of a ewe from this period exhibits the careful and accurate drawing emphasized by the Dusseldorf Academy and shows Bierstadt already to be a deft draftsman and an acute observer of detail. Bierstadt left Dusseldorf and spent much of 1857 exploring Italy. While visiting the Isle of Capri, he made a sketch of this beach scene. Oops, did I skip it? Yep, sorry. Fishing boats at Capri. Amid all the activity are several animals. Particularly well executed are the napping donkey in the foreground and the rooster near him pecking at the waves. Another example from this period is the Roman fish market, Arch of Octavius. And note the lower left, the cat, and then on the lower right, the resting dog. Here's the cat. In 1857, Bierstadt returned to the United States and continued to paint European scenes along with East Coast landscapes. Where animals are included in the finished oils, they are small and subordinated to the landscape. For example, in Gosnold at Cuttyhunk 1602, several deer appear in the foreground and waterfowl are depicted at the lower right. This is a history painting. Cuttyhunk is an island off of the coast of Massachusetts. It was occupied for a few weeks in 1602 by Bartholomew Gosnold, who built a small fort there and planned to harvest sassafras that grew on the island. So you can see their ship in the distance, and then in the middle, that's their fort, and that's their ship. Not long after his return from Europe, Bierstadt determined to use his artistic skills to depict scenery that was still largely unpainted, that of the far west. His first opportunity to go west came in 1859 with Frederick Lander's expedition to survey an overland wagon route. Bierstadt carried with him a small sketchbook, and the majority of the drawings in it are of animals, including bear, deer, and buffalo, which he could refer to when painting oil sketches and eventually finished oils back in his studio. And this is the same sketchbook Peter mentioned in his talk where he showed the bison. And as Peter mentioned, the sketchbook is at Rutgers, and they're trying to digitize it. When I was trying to get copies, the scanner was broken, and the archivist, I know it's Rutgers, and the archivist took this with her iPad for me. So this is a 2-page, and this is a detail of the 1 page. The domestic animals and wildlife in the paintings that Bierstadt produced as a result of this trip, such as those in Thunderstorm in the Rocky Mountains, although eclipsed by the landscape, are the result of direct observation and show a deftness of delineation apparent in the early paintings he completed while in Europe and once back when he got back home in 1858. At times, the animals are convincingly rendered by just the fewest of brushstrokes. And here's a detail of that. And you can see a similarity with the drinking deer and the standing deer in the sketch that we saw. And this is a sketchbook that he referred to for the rest of his career. He kept it in his New York City studio. In paintings where the animals appeared more prominently, but are still subordinated to the landscape, such as Surveyor's Wagon in the Rockies, the same awareness of anatomy and attitude is evident in the artist's realistic representation. Bierstadt made his second trip west in 1863 with writer Fitzhugh Ludlow. And we've already heard Ludlow discuss a little bit today. Ludlow described Bierstadt as always the most indefatigable explorer of every party we were in together. Ludlow was intent on publishing his impressions of the trip. He stated, "It is my object so far as possible to take the reader along with me, let him see what I saw as it occurred, and have him share the suggestions awakened within me as they arose on the spot." And on the right page, we have the title page from his publication, The Heart of the Continent, that was published in 1870. Bierstadt and Ludlow traveled in relative comfort by train from New York to Atchison, Kansas. From their journey was an arduous one, traveling day and night on the overland mail coach, a Concord wagon, which generally only stopped just long enough to change horses and once every 100 miles or so for the passengers to have a meal at one of the more substantial stations. So this is Ludlow sitting on top of the carriage, recording this approaching storm that's coming. The constant jolting and lurching of the coach, along with unpredictable weather and road conditions, not to mention the threat of hostile Indian encounters, made for a harrowing trip, and not one that Bierstadt would make again until the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869. Ludlow, who called himself an amateur scientist, was to record, and Bierstadt to illustrate their travels, which would take them across the plains to Denver, around the Colorado Rockies to Salt Lake City, across the Great Salt Lake Desert, over the Sierra Nevada Range to San Francisco, over to Yosemite, and then subsequently north up to Oregon. Ludlow's narrative was a descriptive account of the people they encountered and their enterprises, together with the flora, the fauna, and the geology of the areas that they passed through. In the spirit of naturalists who had explored the West before them, such as Titian Ramsay Peale and John James Audubon, their approach was fairly scientific, in that they collected specimens, described their finds, sketched, and painted them. Ludlow's published account, The Heart of the Continent, he occasionally mentions Bierstadt's role as an artist. The trip abounded with opportunities for Bierstadt to paint animals. A planned stop on the overland journey was this ranch, the Comstock Ranch in Nebraska, to hunt buffalo. Bierstadt writes, "Our artist, though a good shot and capable of going to market for himself wherever there was any game, as well as most people, had seen enough buffalo hunting in other expeditions to care little for it now, compared with the artistic opportunities which our battue afforded him for portraits of fine old bulls." Bierstadt declared his intention of visiting the battlefield solely as our special artist. Coming upon a bull shot by one of their party that was being held at bay so that Bierstadt could sketch him, Ludlow writes that Bierstadt leapt from the buggy, out came the materials of his success following him, and in a trifle over 3 minutes from his first halt, the big blue umbrella was pointed and pitched, and he sat under it on his camp stool with his color box on his knees, his brush and palette in hand, and a clean board pinned to the cover of his color box. On another occasion, while staying at the Comstock Ranch, a pronghorn antelope was shot and killed, and the head and front quarters were left intact so that Bierstadt could study and paint them. The resulting sketch, while made while somebody held the animal up in a more lifelike pose, is skillfully and accurately rendered. At times, while the others were off hunting, Bierstadt stayed behind to make studies of game and horses. And this study of a fawn could have been from this time as well. When the overland coach made stops, Ludlow took the opportunity to gather specimens, for instance, of lizards, insects, and plants. He called it naturalizing. He explained, however, that mineral specimens were all they could hope to bring home with them because the animal specimens deteriorated. The artist and the writer carried with them a letter from the owner of the stage, Ben Holliday, and his superintendent, Mr. Otis, that they presented to the drivers, instructing them to stop when asked for up to half an hour at a time so that they could get off the wagon and do the sketching and their note-taking. At Fort Kearny, the pair encountered 2 captured buffalo cows, and Ludlow writes, "Our artist held 2 seances with the little creatures on the afternoon of our arrival, and the next morning, transferring them to canvas in every variety of attitude, and getting their animus and typical distinctions as well by heart as he had succeeded in doing their belligerent sires. This resulting study, buffalo calves, captures, as Ludlow points out, the young animal's physical attributes and something of their spirit as well." 2 of the sketches appeared in an illustration titled Buffalo Calves, reproduced in Ludlow's published account of the trip. The buffalo was a recurring theme in Bierstadt's art, as we've seen today, and the animals are skillfully portrayed. Bierstadt made oil studies of bison, and the one shown here probably dates from the 1880s, as we saw in Peter's talk from Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. His depictions of buffalo in finished paintings convincingly capture their lumbering bulk and convey a sense of majesty of the species that once dominated the plains. Also, as discussed in Peter's paper, these paintings, such as Buffalo Trail, often reflect the artist's sensitive interest in and empathy for the species that was being hunted to extinction. In these paintings, the landscape usually dominates. After Bierstadt and Ludlow left Denver, one of the more interesting stops to change horses, especially for Bierstadt, was at the Pine Grove Station, 24 miles north from the North Platte Crossing, at an elevation that Ludlow estimated to be at about 10,000 feet. The station keeper's cabin may have inspired Bierstadt to create his own natural history collection of animals and other objects. Ludlow writes that in the cabin, the skins hung so thick that we could not see the logs. There were grizzly robes and skins from wolves, fox, deer, wolverines, and mountain lions. Ludlow writes that his cabinet of deer and elk horns would have brought hundreds of dollars. Among his trophies, which interested us greatly, were the horns and skin of a bighorn or Rocky Mountain sheep, Ovis, Montana. In 1882, Bierstadt's home and studio Malkasten, named after the artist club in Dusseldorf, burned to the ground, and many of the specimens that he had collected over the years were destroyed. Here you can see up on the wall some of perhaps the elk heads that he collected. The New York City newspaper, The Sun, had an article covering the fire, and they quoted Bierstadt regarding the loss. Bierstadt said that the studio had in it not only some valuable paintings, but what were to me almost priceless, the collection I had made during 10 years in the Rocky Mountains of costumes, carvings, implements, and paraphernalia of various tribes of Indians, and many objects of a branch of natural history in which I had deeply immersed myself. I had made a study of the wild horned animals of this country, and many specimen heads of the deer, wapiti, mountain sheep, and goats from the time their horns start to grow until they are the most perfect specimens obtainable. For instance, I had 14 pairs of wapiti heads. Luckily for Bierstadt, he kept some of his natural history collection in his New York City studio, and this material was saved. A visitor to his Broadway studio in 1892 remarked, "The large studio is a curious place. With its great number of stuffed animals, moose, reindeer, seal, bear, you might imagine that you are in a menagerie." Bierstadt produced paintings in 1859 and in the 1860s that show his growing skill as an animal painter, in such scenes as the Wolf River, Kansas, in which horses in the foreground drink from the river, and in paintings such as Departure of an Indian War Party, in which the animals figure prominently. And both of these paintings are in the exhibit. Bierstadt was an adept horse painter, and on occasion did portraits of horses, along with many completed oil sketches. Departure of an Indian War Party is a superb example of Bierstadt's combining figures within a landscape. The horses are realistically rendered in various attitudes. Even the dog in the foreground is sensitively depicted. Bierstadt captures perfectly the small animal's excitement, his head and ears up in anticipation as he proudly leads the entourage. Two opportunities arose in Bierstadt's career that afforded him the chance to paint animals as the main subject, and that perhaps set the stage for him to produce the handful of Western wildlife paintings that he created in the 1880s. Both were illustrating commissions. The first was to illustrate Ludlow's Heart of the Continent, already mentioned. Of the 13 illustrations based on Bierstadt's artworks that were illustrated, the ones where animals figure prominently are shown here. For all but antelopes, the originals have not been found, and our only points of reference are the wood engravings, which focus on the animals depicted. Antelopes provides us with the opportunity to see how the original grazing antelope was transcribed into the wood engraving. And when comparing the two, we see that Bierstadt's original composition placed equal emphasis on the animals as he had on the landscape, whereas the illustration takes this little grouping here and condenses it. In grazing antelope, although the animals are accurately depicted, they are generalized. Bierstadt was still primarily a landscape painter. And another antelope scene from this period is pronghorn antelopes that's also in this exhibit. In contrast to Bierstadt's paintings, their depictions focus on the animals, but include some landscape as reference to the animal's habitat. Artist-naturalist Titian Ramsay Peale and John James Audubon also painted pronghorn antelope. And in contrast to Bierstadt's painting, their depictions focus on the animal, but include some landscape as reference to the animal's habitat. Peale's approach is the most scientific, here on the left. In pronghorn antelope, Peale captures their physical characteristics, coloration, and markings. Audubon's, on the right, pronghorn antelope, conveys the same information, but he also includes drama and romanticizes the scene by having the left foreground animal prancing and by exaggerating the curve of its neck, giving a sense of regal confidence to the creature. The original painting for prairie dogs has not been located, but the illustration shows that Bierstadt places the animals in their natural environment and depicts them as he observed them, capturing something of the life of the animal. He depicts a village scattered over the prairie, the animals in various poses as they approach their holes, emerge, disappear into them, or stand on their hind legs on guard. Peale and Audubon also painted prairie dogs. Again, Peale's approach was scientific. His is a fact-based interpretation, depicting the animal's physical characteristic as it approaches its burrow, with 3 tiny, sketchily painted animals in the distance to suggest a village. Audubon's depiction is also the result of careful observation, but as in his depiction of the pronghorn antelope, an exaggeration of detail lends a sense of elegance to the creatures, specifically the elongated claws and paws. Audubon also creates a small drama that animates the scene. The prairie dog furthest from the viewer stands and regards the crawling prairie dog in the foreground, who sniffs the air as he approaches a burrow, where a third animal pokes his head out, seemingly unaware of the other 2. Although advancing the natural sciences was not Bierstadt's primary objective, and he did not devote his artistic career to cataloging and painting animal species as did Peale and Audubon, he shared with them the desire for accuracy, obtained from first-hand observation of the animals in their habitat. The illustration from Ludlow's book exemplify a departure from Bierstadt's earlier handling of animals in that the creatures are no longer subordinated to the landscape. This trend continues in the second instance of Bierstadt rendering animals for publication, those that he did for Arthur Pindar Vivian's book, Wanderings in the Western Land, published in London in 1879. Vivian was an English aristocrat and a member of Parliament, as well as the brother-in-law of Bierstadt's good friend, Lord Dunraven, who was a big game hunter and loved Colorado and owned 8,000 acres in and around the town of Estes Park. Bierstadt and the Earl visited Estes Park area together several times, including in the winter of 1876-77, when Bierstadt made sketches for an oil painting of the Colorado Rockies that Lord Dunraven had commissioned. This painting that we see here, Long's Peak, Estes Park. Undoubtedly influenced by his brother-in-law's enthusiasm for the American West, Vivian came to North America in the summer of 1877 for adventure and to hunt. He spent time in the Colorado Rockies, specifically in Estes Park. Vivian camped and hunted in the fall of 1877, keeping a journal of his activities and observations. From Colorado, he proceeded west to California, exploring the Sierra Nevada, including Yosemite, also areas Bierstadt had explored and painted extensively. For Vivian's book, Bierstadt painted a few landscapes, as well as animal scenes, which range from portraits of animals without landscapes, such as wapiti roaring, to wildlife in their habitat, such as a mountain range with black-tailed deer, to a portrait of the animal in situ, the mountain sheep, Ovis montana. The originals on the original paintings on which these illustrations were based still exist, and 2 of them are here in the collection of the Buffalo Bill, Center of the West. This is one in the Buffalo Bill Center's collection. All of the illustrations are black and white, whereas the originals are colored oils. Aside from this difference, however, the illustrations are fairly faithful transcriptions of the originals. Wapiti roaring is from the painting Elk, which is a realistic representation of the animal animated by the act of bugling. As in the illustration, the painted landscape is minimal and sketchily described. The original oil of a mountain range with black-tailed deer is titled Deer in Mountain Home. And, like the illustration, it shows a small group of 4 deer, grazing, resting, and standing. Deer in Mountain Home may have been originally conceived as a pure landscape, to which Bierstadt then added animals. Although carefully painted, the animals seem to sit on the surface of the canvas, rather than reside in the setting. For the mountain sheep Ovis montana, again the engraver made a faithful replica of the original oil painting, Rocky Mountain Sheep on Hill. A large ram looms above the viewer's vantage point, silhouetted against the landscape and sky. The animal is realistically rendered, and Bierstadt includes such details as the rough texture of the horns. This may be the first instance of Bierstadt painting a portrait of a big game animal, that is, focusing primarily on the wildlife and letting the landscape serve as a backdrop. And Bierstadt painted a second version with small variations. The artwork that Bierstadt created for Vivian's book exhibit a new level of animal painting virtuosity and hint at the masterful artworks that the artist would produce in the 1880s. Between the two book illustration commissions, Bierstadt lived for several years in California. From July 1871 until October 1873, he spent most of his time in the Golden State, using San Francisco as his home base. His persistent curiosity for and interest in animals extended to the ocean mammals and seabirds that he encountered off California's coast and on the Farallon Islands. Oil studies such as seal rock spherulons were probably executed en plein air and show the loose brushwork of the artist working quickly to capture the animal's features and attitudes in their natural setting. The scenes exude with energy and the noise of crashing waves and barking seals. The same energy is transcribed into finished oils, such as we see here, Farallon Island. Other contemporary artists who were friends of Bierstadt also painted animals, particularly William Holbrook Beard and William Jacob Hayes. Bierstadt met Beard during his student years in Europe. It's not clear when Beard was in Dusseldorf, but Bierstadt linked up with him in Italy, and along with Whitridge and Sanford Robinson Gifford, the artists explored the Italian countryside to sketch and draw. Back in New York, all four artists, along with Hayes, had studios in the new 10th Street studio building and exhibited their work in many of the same exhibitions. The 10th Street studio building was built in 1857 and was the first building in New York or elsewhere that was constructed specifically to provide studio space for artists. Designed to accommodate an artist's needs, the building contained 23 studios that were roomy, well-lit, and heated, as well as a large central two-story open space where artists could exhibit their art. In the basement was a kitchen where the building's janitor provided inexpensive meals for the tenants. The studio building was highly successful and provided the same sense of brotherhood and camaraderie that many of the artists had experienced in Dusseldorf. William Jacob Hayes had his studio there from 1858 until his death in 1875, William Holbrook Beard from 1861 until his death in 1900, and Bierstadt from 1860 until 1879 when he moved to a studio at 1271 Broadway. It is interesting to speculate on the influence that these two animal painters, Hayes and Beard, may have had on Bierstadt's animal paintings, and Bierstadt may have influenced their careers as well. For example, Bierstadt's enthusiasm for the West could have prompted Hayes and then Beard to venture west to see it for themselves. Beard made his first trip west in 1859, and in 1860, Hayes explored the upper Missouri country, as had artist George Catlin, Carl Bodmer, and John James Audubon before him. Up to that point, Hayes did mostly animal portraits, such as this Cairn Terrier. It was Hayes's only journey west, but he gathered enough material on the trip to produce paintings of the far west for the rest of his career. A disciplined observer of detail, Hayes was an artist and a naturalist. He is probably best known for his series of buffalo paintings showing huge herds covering the western prairies. And Peter discussed some of these and also noted that Hayes was published in natural science publications as well. Hayes meticulously researched his subjects. Both the flora and the fauna were based on his notes and sketches from his western trip. He completed 2 paintings of a prairie dog village. A small one, 25 by 47, that dates to 1860, and a second larger one that measures 36 by 72 and dates to 1867. The 2 scenes are similar to the one Bierstadt painted of prairie dogs after his 1863 trip with Ludlow. Like Bierstadt's composition, they're a realistic representation of the animals, showing them in all their various activities, and also, as in Bierstadt's painting, the village is expansive and visible in the distance, prairie, as far as the eye can see. It's not known if Bierstadt saw either of Hayes's prairie dog scenes, but given the socializing and the interaction that went on among the artists of the 10th Street Studio building, and the fact that the 1867 painting is quite large and undoubtedly attracted attention, he probably did. Both William Beard and his older brother, James Henry Beard, were animal painters, and along with Hayes, much of their early work depicted domestic animals, often portraits of pets. Beard went on to specialize in satirizing human behavior and weaknesses by portraying animals in roles such as in this oil, So You Want to Get Married. William Beard made one trip west in 1866 to Denver and the surrounding area, undoubtedly influenced by Bierstadt's and others' enthusiasm for and depiction of the beauty of this new frontier. Unlike Bierstadt, however, Beard was not overly impressed with what he saw. While in Denver, he wrote to his wife, "I think I shall go back to the States and make some sketches of different things much more useful to me than anything I can get here. The fact is, I'm disappointed in the Rocky Mountains somewhat. Still, I'm very glad I came. I have seen some grand things, and I would not take anything from my experience, but I would not like to go through with it again." Rather than unspoiled nature, Beard preferred the city and its human inhabitants, with their vices and weaknesses, to inspire his fertile imagination, to create the animal scenes that evoked human frailties. He did produce a handful of Western scenes, though, and they're just wonderful paintings. One of them is this one, and this is also here at the Buffalo Bill Center. Deer on the Prairie that he painted in 1884. It's a poignant, sensitive scene depicting a group of deer nearing the edge of a stream, the main herd still in the distance on a bluff. They are accurately drawn, and Beard expertly captures their wary, tentative approach to drink water, alert for predators. The riverbank on the right blocks our view of the distance, but on the left, the vastness of the prairie is depicted. Beard creates a moody scene and imbues his animals with feeling and attitude, in contrast to Bierstadt's drier, more objective artist-naturalist approach. Contemporary to Bierstadt were two of the 19th century's most accomplished and famous animal painters, the French artist Rosa Bonheur, whom Emily discussed for us today, and the English artist Sir Edwin Henry Landseer. Bierstadt was friends with the former and acquainted with the latter, and very familiar with the work of both artists. Rosa Bonheur painted a portrait of a lion in 1893 and inscribed it to her friend Bierstadt, and Bierstadt had given Western landscape studies to the artist for reference when she made her own paintings of a West she never visited. When Bierstadt organized the New Bedford's first exhibition in 1858, he asked Landseer to participate, and the artist lent a painting of a Scottish hunting dog to the show. In 1868, Bierstadt gave a dinner for the poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow at the Langham Hotel in London, and Landseer attended the dinner at Bierstadt's invitation. Bierstadt's painting Rocky Mountain Sheep on a Hill, illustrated in Vivian's book that we saw earlier, recalls most closely the work of Edwin Landseer, particularly Landseer's painting Monarch of the Glen. Painted in 1851, Monarch of the Glen was a highly successful and popular painting and was widely reproduced. It is a romanticized depiction of a large and muscular stag that stands before majestic violet mountains. The deer has a regal attitude, and its dominance and superiority are unquestionable. To add to the sense of superiority is the vantage point the artist uses. He puts the viewer below the stag looking up, as though the stag is on a pedestal. Bierstadt uses the same low vantage point in Rocky Mountain Sheep on Hill. Again, a muscular and superior example of the species is set before a mountainous landscape. The illustrated wood engravings for Ludlow's and Vivian's books do not do justice to the originals because they lack the detail and most of the gradations of tonality, which is evident when comparing the wood engravings with the finished oils. However, this disparity between illustration and original diminished as technology improved. In 1884, another of Bierstadt's animal portraits, Rocky Mountain Sheep, was reproduced as a steel engraving as opposed to wood engraving. And it's titled Rocky Mountain Sheep or Bighorn Ovis Montana. And in it, the nuances of detail and tone are captured. The original oil is carefully painted. The animals are accurately depicted, as are the lichen-covered rocks that form the pedestal on which the main sheep is perched. Its large size, 50 by 42, and the choice of canvas rather than paper, which Bierstadt used for many of his artworks, indicate that the artist conceived of this painting as a major artwork. As in Landseer's Monarch of the Glen, Bierstadt's earlier Rocky Mountain Sheep on Hill, the animal is placed above the viewer, looking down on the rest of the world. The engraving was published in the April issue of the Official Journal of the American Art Union. It was well received, and one critic wrote, "With his well-known love of the sublime in nature, Mr. Bierstadt has gone well to go up among the clouds and the eternal snows of the American Alps to depict for us these hardy climbers in their chosen haunts." Bierstadt's venture into the new genre, that of animal painting, coincided with a decline in the popularity of his artwork and that of many of his colleagues as new art movements took hold and public taste changed. He might have been casting about for new ideas for his art. At the same time, concern for the loss of wildlife and its habitat was growing. Bierstadt was a skilled animal painter, and he loved the western wildlife and wilderness, and so to create a group of wildlife portraits was a logical direction for him to pursue. During the 1880s, conservation of wildlife and its habitat was being increasingly promoted. Theodore Roosevelt, an ardent outdoorsman and hunter, had been west and seen for himself the shrinking herds in their range. In the March 1886 issue of Outing, Roosevelt wrote an article entitled "Ranch Life and Game Shooting in the West." In it, he expresses his concern for the safe future of wildlife and its habitat in America. He opens the article with the following statement: "To see the rapidity with which the larger kinds of game animals are being exterminated throughout the United States is really melancholy. 25 years ago, or even 15 years ago, the western plains and mountains were in places fairly thronged with deer, elk, antelope, and buffalo. Indeed, there was then no other part of the world save South Africa where the number of individuals of large game animals was so large. All of this has now been changed, or else is being changed at a really remarkable rate of speed. The buffalo are already gone. A few straggling individuals, and perhaps here and there a herd so small that it can hardly be called more than a squad, are all that remain. Over 4/5 of their former range, the same fate has befallen the elk, and their number, even among the mountainous haunts, which still afford them a refuge, is greatly decreased. The shrinkage among deer and antelope has been relatively nearly as serious. There are but few places left now where it is profitable for a man to take hunting as a profession. The brutal skin hunters and meat butchers of the woods and prairies have done their work." To protect wildlife and their habitat, in 1887, as we heard in Peter's paper, Roosevelt founded the Boone and Crockett Club and a hunter conservationist organization, and Bierstadt was an enthusiastic founding member. His animal paintings of the 1880s were in part a response to the jeopardy these great animals faced and an effort to bring attention to their plight. In 1880, it is thought that Bierstadt traveled to Maine and to the Canadian province of New Brunswick to hunt moose. He painted at least 3 compositions of a bull moose in its woodland habitat. Of his wildlife paintings that might be considered portraits, most are oils on paper and measure approximately 14 by 19 inches, the size that fit in his traveling paint box, and the size he used throughout his career. These paintings include Rocky Mountain Sheep on Hill, already discussed, as well as these two, Mountain Sheep on Hill, Bighorn Sheep and Study of a Bighorn Ram, as well as Rocky Mountain Goat, on the left is in the current exhibition, and Study of Mountain Goats. In all these paintings, the animals are placed on rocky precipices and are viewed from a low vantage point. They're placed above the viewer and silhouetted against a cloudy sky or darkened landscape. They're depicted as noble creatures in a vast wilderness terrain. Only one other large wildlife portrait has been identified, Rocky Mountain Goats. Bierstadt had a pair of preserved mountain goats that he kept in his, here and there's the moose, in his New York City studio that survived the fire that burned his studio down in 1882. Vertical in format like Rocky Mountain Sheep and approximately the same size, this painting of Rocky Mountain Goats may have been a companion piece to that painting. It's an ambitious composition, a group portrait depicting 5 individuals convincingly situated within a rocky landscape, the animal's habitat. The large male, evoking a sense of strength and dominance, stands on a rocky outcrop, the others below on a rare patch of grass. For the animal illustration in Ludlow's and Vivian's books, Bierstadt's approach was the straightforward one of an artist-naturalist. In contrast, his buffalo paintings of the 60s and 70s were more subjective interpretations of the artist's respect for the creature as well as his compassion and sympathy concerning their threatened demise. In the animal portraits of the 1880s, we see a new interpretation, one of physical fitness and power. On his trip to Yellowstone in 1881, Bierstadt enthused about roughing it and that he had felt better for it. He continued, "Why, I have become so accustomed to robust exercise that now I am in the midst of civilization, I hardly know what to do with myself." Paintings such as Rocky Mountain sheep and mountain goats, in which the animals exude vigor and vitality, are a reflection of the artist's own sense of well-being after his time in the Yellowstone wilderness. Another painting of the 1880s that combines wildlife in its habitat with the notion of a regal portrait is Monarch of the Plains. Although a realistic composition based on first-hand observation, it is also romanticized. As in Landseer's Monarch of the Glen, Bierstadt establishes a low vantage point. The viewer looks up at the stag, who, alert and watchful, looks out into the distance beyond the viewer. Behind him on the left and to the right, females in the herd are also alert, their heads up and watchful. As Bierstadt had learned in Dusseldorf, he masterfully juxtaposes light and dark areas to animate the surface of the painting and to create the illusion of a receding space. A dark and foreboding sky is behind the male, but the sun has broken through a hole in the clouds and sheds a golden light on the animals. Perhaps the artist was suggesting that although the future for these animals is uncertain, there is still hope and still time to save them. You didn't think you were going to get through a lecture without this painting, did you? Bierstadt's major painting of the 1880s, The Last of the Buffalo, showcases the artist's superior skills as both an animal painter and a landscapist. He painted two versions, as we've already learned today. And as you've also learned today, it was rejected in 1889 for the Paris Exhibition Universelle. And J.G. Brown, a member of the selection committee, said it had been turned down because it was too big and not representative of his style. Unlike most of his previous works, the primary subject matter was not the landscape, but a dynamic figural composition with a narrative. In the last 20 years, Bierstadt had seen the buffalo herds decimated and the Indians' way of life destroyed. He said of the work, "I have endeavored to show the buffalo in all his aspects and depict the cruel slaughter of a noble animal now almost extinct. Bones are strewn across the foreground and midgrounds, along with dead and dying buffalo, a dead Indian, and his horse lying among them. The main action, spotlighted as though on stage, is a mounted Indian and a buffalo in battle. The Indian plunges his spear into the buffalo as the buffalo gores the Indian's horse. Neither will emerge as a winner in this conflict. Bierstadt shows the two entities who are on the verge of extinction killing each other. Possibly with some of Beard's irony, Bierstadt does not depict the real culprit in the demise of both the Indian and the buffalo, the proliferation and depredations of white civilization. Bierstadt does not seem to have exhibited his wildlife portraits. Of the ones that we know of, Rocky Mountain sheep was the only one publicized as fine art. Aside from this painting, the public would have known of his animal paintings primarily by visiting his studio and through the wood engravings in Ludlow's and Vivian's books. To wrap up, Bierstadt was a prolific and proficient animal painter. His interest in realism and accuracy led him to be an amateur naturalist, and he collected specimens that he could refer to when painting. His depictions of wildlife range from the realism of direct observation to subjective interpretations based on his sympathy and empathy for an endangered species, and to the romanticism found in the work of such diverse painters as Audubon and Landseer. Bierstadt undoubtedly welcomed the illustrating opportunities he received from Ludlow and Vivian to paint scenes of wildlife in the West. Perhaps encouraged by the success of these artworks at a time when his popularity was declining and motivated by the burgeoning interest in conservation, he painted a small number of wildlife portraits in the 1880s. That he painted the animals in these pictures as robust, hardy specimens was in part inspired by his 1881 trip to Yellowstone and 3 months of rugged wilderness living. Although primarily a landscape painter, Bierstadt's deep interest in and fascination for depicting animals is evidenced by the dozens of oil sketches and studies of animals he produced, and by the fact that animals appear in so many of his finished paintings, whether as small embellishments or as the main subject, at times sharing the limelight with the landscape. Thank you, and I welcome any comments or questions.
Thank you.